When you think of activism, you might picture protests, petitions, or speeches that demand change at full volume. But what if activism could also sound like an open hand? What if it could be a conversation that make people want to lean in instead of walk away? My guest today, Qasim Rashid, is a human rights lawyer, an author, and activist who understands the courage it takes to speak up. In fact, he doesn't even say it's courage, it's just something that we should be doing. For many in immigrant communities, the stakes of activism are very high. There's a fear of losing opportunities, fear of legal consequences, fear of standing out when survival has always meant blending in. And yet Qasim has built his life around the belief that silence is more dangerous than dissent. What sets him apart is not just his willingness to change injustice, it's the way he holds space for those willing to change. He doesn't just call it out, he calls his people in. He extends his hand to those in a messy middle, those who are unlearning harmful beliefs, those who are just beginning to see the cracks in the system that they once trusted. So in this conversation, we go very deep into grassroots activism, the role of empathy in creating safer communities, and how to engage in activism without letting anger or hostility take the lead. We talk about why activism is vital to the health of our society and our relationships, and what to do when it begins to strain the very connections we care about the most. We're going to explore questions that matter now more than ever. How do we make activism a place people run towards instead of running away from? Welcome to Reframing Perspectives, the podcast where we challenge traditional thinking and explore the power of empathy in conscious leadership, personal growth, and human connection. I'm Dr. Payal Beri, and in each episode, we dive into thought-provoking conversations that expand perspectives and spark transformation. Because empathy reframes perspectives. Let's begin. Qasim, I'm so happy to have you here. It's such an important topic on what's going on in our society and our world right now, and you play such a core role in what's happening and your way of educating people, your way of enlightening people, building awareness. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Privileged to join you, my friend. How are you?
I am good, and I'm also very nervous. I'm nervous about the state of the world. I'm nervous about the relationships being fractured within our families, within friends. I see it with, just even in my own family, things happening.
Yeah.
But before we even dive into any of that, Qasim, I think it's important I want to know, because I know you, Qasim, obviously as this human rights activist, as this lawyer who's out there, who's doing incredible work. But what I want to know is the Qasim before all of this, the Qasim behind the activism, right? I want to understand that before you were known for activism and for what you're doing, when was the first moment that you realized that you couldn't be silent?
It's such a beautiful question. I don't know if there was a single moment where I felt I couldn't be silent. I think I was fortunate to have amazing parents and amazing teachers at a very young age. And I was raised in an environment where speaking up against injustice wasn't seen as some special act, but the norm. You take a shower every day, you brush your teeth every day, you speak up for injustice when you see it. It was just like a normal part of what living was. Born in Pakistan, came here at a very young age, raised in the late 80s and early 90s. And at my mosque, there was a combination of South Asians like me and also Black Americans who were some of the pioneers of Islam in America in the 20th century. And at the time, I didn't realize it, but these were the same people who, when they were in their teens, 20s, and 30s, were marching in the civil rights movements in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. That's who they were. And unbeknownst to me, I'm being trained on things like human rights and empathy and compassion and absolute justice and racial justice and gender justice by the people who did the work, by the people who were leading the marches and suffering police brutality and suffering white supremacist violence and rising above it all. And for them, it was a fusion of their acceptance of Islam as a religion and the ardent focus on justice in Islam, like, let's even let alone leave aside the theology aspect of it. That's an important conversation, but on this principle of absolute justice for all humanity, and then kind of navigating that through what's happening in the civil rights era of the United States. And so I come in, as a Pakistani kid who doesn't know the first thing about American history, but my earliest teachers are these pioneers, these juggernauts, these just icons of human rights and racial justice and social justice. And so I think in many respects, this was an extraordinarily beautiful grace bestowed upon me, that I had amazing teachers. And of course, my parents were aligned with them. They're active in the mosque and active in the Muslim community. And so for them, it was thrilling for them to see me learn from these icons. And the only thing I did probably was just have the good sense to shut up and listen. That's basically it. I mean, I can't take credit for anything else other than just shutting up and listening, which, if you know me, getting me to shut up can be a hard thing to do sometimes. But that's basically it. So I think as I got older and saw just injustice in the world in general, it was just my natural knee-jerk reaction to say, hey, this is what I've been trained to do in response to this kind of whatever the injustice was. And so let me just do whatever I can to act on that.
Wow. So you saw courage from a very young age.
Yes. And I think that's where I want to emphasize. I don't even think I saw it as this is me being courageous. I just saw that as, well, why wouldn't you do that? Why would you just sit silent on something bad happening? It's not courageous to speak up. It's the thing you do. And that's what I've tried to imbibe in my life today as well.
I think it's really interesting because you're absolutely right. It is the right thing to do. It's like, if someone is being beat up, would you just walk away? No, you would do something about it. Even if you don't necessarily want to get involved with the fight, you would call the cops. You would do something to help prevent the person who's being beat up or whatever it is. But a lot of immigrants, like myself as well, and I think about my family, there's this idea of this fear that comes in about, don't get involved, don't ruffle the feathers, like just stay quiet. There's fear baked in with the idea of speaking up because of what they may have experienced back home in India or the partition that they came through. All of those things are baked into that DNA of that. So even though they believe it, I know my parents are just like really upset about what's going on. They, watch the news, they do all these things, they have the conversations, but they're not necessarily going to take action outside because there's a fear baked in. So someone like me who grew up with that, I will say that earlier this year when, with the administration coming in and everything, there was this idea of, oh, wait a second, I'm an immigrant, like I'm a naturalized citizen. I'm not a, born here citizen. Can I speak up? Should I speak up? Should I be careful now? What should I do? Like it just gets put into you. So how do you talk to immigrant families and immigrant, adults that have this fear and didn't grow up with the same type of role modeling that you did?
Well, I think, I remember asking my father this very same question years ago, and he just passed a few months ago, and I'm, contemplative and reflective over his legacy and the sacrifices he made. I think I was probably in my early 20s in the post 9/11 environment where whether you were Muslim or not, if you looked Muslim enough, you were targeted. And I remember making this complaint to him that, we're young, we're broke, we don't really have any resources. Your generation has the resources, has the money. Why isn't your generation doing more? And he said, son, think of it this way. Let's assume in your 20s, early 30s, you left everything you knew behind and moved to a country where you don't know the language, don't know the culture, don't know the history, don't know the laws, don't know the rules, but you're there for a better life because you believe that's to be true. And you're correct in that belief. And then you're asked, now go and fight the injustice in this new system. It's a scary prospect. He goes, my generation did the best we could to get you here and to give you the resources and the support that we could never have dreamed of in Pakistan. Now it's your job. You have the platform. You're not being asked to make the sacrifice that we made of giving everything up, leaving our parents behind, our siblings behind, everything we ever knew behind for this new world. We've given that to you. Now you need to go forth and make the most of it and build off of our shoulders. And he was right. Now that's not to excuse the aunties and uncles who are, maybe overtly racist, which I think we see in our communities. Anti-Black racism is an epidemic in the South Asian community. This is not to excuse any of that. It is to say that young people, I think of our generation and younger, maybe even a few years older than us, I would say anyone under 50, has a different perspective, has a different ability than the previous generation. I suspect that our time and efforts and resources are most efficiently used in building up this newer generation. Right? That's how you reform nations, by reforming their youth, by getting their youth aligned on the future. Because now you're investing not just in the next 10 years, you're investing in the next half century or 75 years. So that's where my focus is. How do we focus on folks of our generation, of the younger generation, to ensure that we are building long-term success? That's the only way that we're going to address these issues. As much as we live in a clickbait culture and we want to flip on a light switch or hit a retweet and problem solved, life doesn't work that way. It requires generational investment. And I think for me, it's not difficult to acknowledge that there are struggles with older generations while appreciating the sacrifices they have made that have allowed me and you and other folks of our generation to do things that our parents and grandparents could never have dreamed of.
What does that look like, though, for the younger generation who recognizes that, I think differently than my parents. I know I have that, I know that I can have these conversations with my mom, but with my dad, it's a little bit more difficult. And so, I have these conversations and I get it, but how do you then, in your goal, in your mission to help the younger generation take it one step forward, what does that look like?
Well, it's another really important question, and I'll give a couple of quantitative, objective things to do. I'll also say, even someone like my own father, who was adamant on issues of justice, would get nervous when I would get the death threats, and when I had to go to federal court to testify against the person who wanted to kill me and my children for my faith as a Muslim. And he would say, maybe tone down just a little bit. And I'd say, too late, you already created this monster, I can't stop now. And so even for someone like my father, who was extraordinarily social justice and justice minded, when it's your kid being attacked, your parental log goes in and you say, well, maybe self-preservation is a better option here. And that's not for any other reason. That's what any parent would do. That's what I would do to my kids if I saw somebody attacking my kids. I bring that up because I don't want young people to think that you'll ever get to a place where your parents are going to be in full agreement with you in your efforts to advance justice. And that shouldn't be a restriction. But as far as what to do, well, one, don't wait for permission. No one is going to give you a sign like you're at a stoplight and it turns green where you're like, okay, now I can start doing the work. Take action now. And then that action is not going to be something seismic like Rosa Parks sitting on the bus. Because if you study that history, that was a 13-year process to get to that point. That didn't just happen. The way we romanticize it now is that one day she decided, you know what, I'm going to sit down and it caused this whole, a revolution. That's not what happened. This was decades in the making. She was preceded by Irene Morgan, by Claudette Colvin, names that most people probably haven't heard, but other young black women who also refused to stand up and who also suffered and were beaten and were arrested as a result of their civil disobedience. So take the small actions now, whether that is supporting right now your immigrant communities who are being targeted by ICE, whether that is pushing back against the violent legislation, and I call it violent legislation, banning reproductive health access, it's medical violence, and the list goes on and on. And then furthermore, and this I can't emphasize enough, be authentic in your story and get involved in local office. No one expects you to run for U.S. Senate or president and win that. No one expects you to be a Zoran Mamdani and win for the largest city in the country. But you can get involved in your local school board, your local city council, your local parks commissioner. These are all pivotal and critical roles to normalize our existence and our participation. And if you don't want to run, get involved with a local candidate. Volunteer, knock doors, make phone calls. And if you have a few extra bucks to donate money, donate money. We get into this mindset that unless I can solve every problem with one fatal blow, I'm not going to even try to solve the problem. But that just doesn't exist except in the movies. What happens in real life is you activate yourself, you organize those people around you, and then you transform a community. And that's what you need to do. Activate, organize, and you organize by mobilizing them. And then over the course of a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, you begin to transform a community. These are all things within your capacity, regardless of how much money you have or don't have, but they're all things that are extraordinarily effective, especially when they're done consistently over months and years.
You mentioned that, and I think that's one thing that people can get wrong. And I know sometimes in the past I have as well, where it's this idea that activism is Rosa Parks, activism is going on the streets, activism is, screaming loudly. And this is where, I'm really curious on your perspective on this, because there's a lot of, as we talked earlier before we started recording this hostility, and there's aggression right now when we see it in activism. And I consider it performative activism when we see a lot of noise on like LinkedIn, on these social platforms, of individuals who are screaming and loudly saying things, but they're not actually taking actions behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, how is it different from activism that is seen where someone is taking it onto the streets and protesting that way, versus if they're saying it's a digital protest?
Well, I'd like to think of the digital extension as a necessary component, but not as a sufficient component. And I like to think of being out in the streets as a necessary component, but not as a sufficient component. Here's the thing. These are all elements of the overall work product that we need to do. There are certain people for whom the digital aspect is the extent of what they can do. Maybe they have a disability. Maybe they have mobility issues. Maybe they're a caretaker for an elderly person, and they can contribute in other ways that don't require being out in the streets. Maybe there's folks who just don't like technology, and all they would rather do is be out in the streets. Maybe there's folks who don't want to be out in the streets, but they are in the offices of your elected member of Congress or Senate to say, hey, here's what we need you to do. The point I'm trying to make is there's no one wrong way to do it, and there's no one right way to do it. But what happens is people mistake online activism for meaningful progress. Look, I don't care how many retweets or shares or likes you got. At the end of the day, we need to translate that into how are we changing policy? How are we increasing voter registration? How are we electing people funded by people instead of corporations and foreign PACs and lobbies? And again, this is why I say there's no one magic button or one silver bullet that's going to do all these things. I'm extraordinarily active in the social media space, posting daily content. But guess what? I'm also in the courtrooms. I'm also representing immigrants trying to get their citizenship. I'm also raising tens of thousands. Actually, I'll take it back. I've raised over millions of dollars for social justice organizations to combat climate injustice, to combat genocide, to combat fires. I mean, you name it, from Pakistan to Lahaina, to Mali, to Guatemala, to LA, Katrina, across the world, Turkey. I will travel to these locations and provide support as a first responder on the ground. And so all that to say is part of a comprehensive approach. And I will say one thing, my frustration with some folks on the left, and I consider myself on the left, is, and this goes back to your conversation about empathy. It's easy for us to look at folks on the right and say, you lack empathy, and then turn around and yell at people for not being more empathetic enough. Like, it's such a bizarre contradiction in terms. I recently put up a post that said, if you're seeing people finally wake up to the genocide happening in Gaza, and your first instinct is to yell at them, what took you so long? I'm sorry, you're not helping the cause. I mean, you have a right to be angry, and I've told people who are finally speaking up, people are going to be upset with you, and they have a right to be angry. One, that shouldn't slow you down, because you should be speaking up because it's a genocide and you need to speak up. And also, and this is a key point, and also, it's never too late to be on the right side of history. And what I want folks on the left to understand is that, we can be completely valid that someone should have spoken up sooner and be completely right, but that still doesn't address the underlying problem that we lack the coalition necessary to stop this genocide. And that's why it's so much more critical that we continue to invite in new members to the coalition to build that out. And that will only happen if we are truly empathetic to basically the point of martyrdom, because that's what's going to happen if we're not able to band together against these injustices that we face.
That post is actually what made me want to really reach out to you, because that relationship of empathy and how we extend our hand to somebody who is just waking up, who's just realizing, first of all, there's so much conversation that happens behind the scenes with people of, I'm afraid to speak up now because I'm going to get canceled. I'm afraid to say this because now I'm going to be, laughed at or whatever it is. And so there's even this idea that when we shame somebody for like, well, now finally you woke up to this, finally you understand this, they're just going to retract backwards. They're like, you know what, never mind. I don't want to be a part of this. So it's, again, that human relationship. But what I want to understand from you is, How do you hold that compassion and empathy and extend your hand to the other side, that the people who are waking up and are realizing, oh my gosh, I made a mistake. I can't believe I voted for this person. I can't believe I did this. I wasn't paying attention enough. And now I want to join and I want to understand and I want to advocate and I want to be on the right side of history. How do you help that relationship between empathy and extending the hand, as well as accountability to what has happened?
Yeah, no, I love that because empathy, is the trust but verify aspect. Like I'll trust you that you're sincere, but I'm going to verify that you actually are serious and not just take your word for granted. I think there's a couple of things I think about. The two main ones is one from the faith-based perspective, and one is from the kind of contemporary, practical reality. And to me, faith isn't blind. Faith is taking a step where you may not necessarily see the end of the road, but you're confident in the steps in front of you to get you there. And from a faith-based perspective, what I mean is, from an Islamic perspective, one thing that makes Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, so special is that his actions exemplify his teachings. It's not theory. It's not, I joke with my Christian friends who often wear the "What would Jesus do" bracelets. If Muslims were to wear those bracelets, we would say, do what Muhammad did. Because in these situations, we see how he responded. And there's so many examples that I can give where people who had actively tried to kill him, people who successfully killed his closest companions, people who successfully killed his children, later came and asked for forgiveness and amnesty, and he granted it. And that, to me, is a level of empathy that I cannot even fathom, let alone, God forbid, somebody, unalive one of my children. If they harmed them, I'm not a violent person, but I don't know how I would react if I saw them harm one of my children. And so for him to lead by example, that this is the culmination, this is the capacity of what a human being can do. And you as a Muslim are called to reach and to pursue that capacity. That tells me that I can always expand my breadth of empathy. And I say this knowing full well that I have a long, long way to go. I'm nowhere near 100th of 1/10 of 1% to the level that I need to get to. But then from a practical side, I think about, and I alluded to this earlier, that we are facing an existential crisis on a global level right now between the haves and the have-nots. The wealthy are, we face the largest wealth and income inequality gap really in modern world history. The amount of money being spent on wars is increasing exponentially, right? Tupac, I got money for war but can't feed the poor. And we are seeing, Hannah Arendt talks about that the death of human empathy is one of the first signs that society is about to descend into barbarism. And I feel like we are on that cusp right now. And so for me, the alternative to expanding my scope of empathy is that. I kind of see this as a binary. There's really no middle ground in this space. Either you're going to be apathetic to genocide or you're going to actively condemn genocide. Either you're going to be apathetic to the starvation and genocide in Sudan, or you're going to actively work against it. Either you're going to be apathetic to the suffering in Congo, or you're going to stand against it. And so for me, those are the two binaries I use the word force because I'm forcing myself to stay focused on, that if I push this person away because they didn't say something the exact right way, then ultimately I risk pushing them into a camp where empathy is being killed. And I can't risk that. Now, I'm not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but that helps me take a moment to pause, to reflect, to step back, and to ensure that when I move forward on a particular issue, it's not out of anger or rage, or if it is out of anger or rage, it's channeled into meaningful progress as opposed to just being reactionary.
I think that's a really powerful statement over there about, even when you are in anger and rage, that you take that time to then say, okay, but how am I channeling this, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that there's also this gap in our ability to understand how to. There's a lot of emotional labor that's going on right now of just like, emotions that we're not able to process well. It hasn't been taught. It's been, in fact, being reprimanded if you are, having that emotional intelligence to be able to have that empathy and compassion. The fact that empathy is now being called a sin in conservative right side, and they're using that to weaponize in order to make sure that people don't then feel sad for, marginalized groups because they're trying to remove the human element to them, and they're trying to create it where now you can objectify them. How do you, and I want to know this from more of a like tactical and everyday, for the everyday person who isn't necessarily so involved in activism, but how do you take that, and how do you look at that empathy is now being seen as a sin, and how do you take that piece and actually show in a tactical way what it is doing to our society and how it's like really breaking the threads of our culture?
I think one of the reasons why they're seeing empathy as a sin is because they're excusing it as a veneer for racism and white supremacy and misogyny. This nation was founded on two original sins, the genocide of one people and the enslavement of another. And I would probably add a third one, the abject oppression of women, period, right? I mean, even to this day, women don't have equal rights in this country with the Equal Rights Amendment still in limbo. And it's one thing to commit these horrific crimes, bad enough in and of itself. It's compounded by the fact that there's never been any kind of meaningful reparations or restitution or Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And then that's further compounded now with this current regime actively rewriting history, actively, canceling things like CBS, actively undermining the basic things that are required of a society to learn from its history. One of the life-changing moments I had growing up was when my father was in South Africa. I got to visit him for about 2 months. And we got to visit Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela was held prisoner for 27 years. And I remember looking as a young 18-year-old into his prison cell. I'm not a tall guy, I'm 5'10" maybe on a good day. And realizing that I, even as someone who's not particularly tall, wouldn't be able to lay down straight in this prison cell. And that he spent 27 years in this godforsaken dungeon. And to me, recognizing that South Africa had then instituted Truth and Reconciliation Commissions to meaningfully address these issues, and trust me, they have a long way to go yet, but recognizing that despite that, in the United States, having gone through nearly 400 years of genocide and enslavement and Jim Crow, there has never been even so much as an acknowledgement of that. I began to realize there's something seriously, devastatingly broken here. Shortly thereafter, a year after that was 9/11, and I think we've seen the backlash since then. So that's kind of where empathy is being scapegoated now. That, wait, you're going to have empathy for Black people, you're going to have empathy for Latinos, you're going to have empathy for trans people, you're going to have empathy for immigrants. That's weakness. And it's actually a cover for white supremacy. It's actually a cover for structural eugenics. I've been writing about this for a while as well. It's a cover for misogyny. That's really all it is. And it's hijacking Christianity. Christian nationalism is now mainstream in the US government. It's now mainstream in our judiciary. And so while as much as they want to claim that, this whole, being woke is being weak and go woke, go broke, and all these kind of, absurd, childish slogans they have, it's all a veneer for white supremacy. It's all a veneer for racial injustice. And I think the way we get out of it is by identifying that for what it is and being able to push back directly against that.
There are two things that come to mind. One is that with empathy and the way that you spoke about it is like, wait, we have to have empathy for Black people. We have to have empathy for women. Like, what is this? And I feel like it's being painted as if it's a threat to you, right? So it's this idea that if we create a space where they are able to have the same equal rights you are, like it does really boggle my mind that men's healthcare rights are not questioned. It's just natural. It just is, you just have it. Yeah. But a woman's healthcare rights is debatable. And it's like, this is still a human body. You're still having to have the same, challenges you need support around. But it's this idea that as if here's a pie and you get a slice and you get a slice. Oh no, there's only one slice left. And we treat humanity as if that, we went shopping and there's only a basket of however many balls or however many pies. And, if we run out, we run out. But humanity isn't that, right? So right. That's the first thing that comes to my mind about as you're speaking about it. It's like it's been massaged as if it's going to take something away from you. And the second piece of that is what I think is also important to discuss is that, you know, as a society, we're also still learning and relearning how to show up in our local communities, especially after COVID, when, you know, everyone just kind of retracted back. And there's this break that really happened. I generally believe we live in a very different world than we did pre-COVID. And so people are still learning how to rebuild those connections. So then when you have this propaganda of empathy is a sin, you know, it's taking things away from you. It's, you know, a form of, you know, suppressing it's quietly building white supremacy and it's taking away from everything else. I think that there's also this idea then that everyday person who's not consciously thinking about this and is just kind of moving around their day on a daily basis, they're then getting exhausted by these like back and forth conversations, and that empathy is then being diluted. And from there, I'm just wondering, how does society, how does that individual person who's not consciously actively thinking about this all the time, how do they really get involved in rebuilding community at a grassroots level? How do they get involved so that they're not getting fatigued by all this, you know, overstimulation of propaganda, and they're actually being like, wait a second, you know, me as someone who's part of the younger generation who can still has energy, who can still mobilize, what do I need to learn about community building for the first time because I haven't had access to that before? I haven't thought about it from that angle before.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things you're referring to about rights and pie is this old saying that when you've had privilege your whole life, equality feels like oppression. And that's kind of the world that we're in. And for those who have that burning desire to say, I need to do more, I often remind folks that it has to come internally. It's not going to come externally. And it's one of those things where it's kind of human nature to put your head down and work on self-preservation and say, let me just make sure I can pay my rent, buy my groceries, make sure my kids get to school safely. And there's nothing wrong with that. I will never knock someone for focusing on that self-preservation. I will say for those who want to take it to the next level, who, to me, the analogy I give is the moment you realize that it's actually more dangerous to be in your comfort zone than to step out is the moment that you're going to start to really get into activism. And that journey is a special journey because not only are you going to then begin to understand just how much you've been in a comfort zone and been wearing rose-colored glasses, but I see kind of this spike, right? When people start to get active, they have this rage form and they want to go and take over the world, and they're idealistic and they get upset at other people for not being as idealistic and active as they are. And I never tell folks to calm down. I never tell them to relax because I think it's a natural part of the human development for them to kind of see exactly what they've been missing. I almost see it as a trauma response where they are kicking themselves at how could I have been so silent for so long? How could I have missed all this? And let me try to make all that time up that the last 20 years I should have been doing it. Let me make it up in the next 2 months. And it's a trauma response, if you ask me. And what I tell those folks is just remember this moment, the rage you're feeling right now. And I would only ask you not to calm down, not to tone it down, because I think that's silly. I would only ask you to do yourself the favor and ask, how can I make this sustainable? How can I ensure that the level of activism that I'm engaging in is sustainable? And that, in my view, is a good way for them to understand that I'm not asking them to censor themselves or to limit themselves. I'm asking them to invest in their long-term growth as well. And it's just like, you and I are avid in maintaining our personal health. I'm training for a half marathon right now. I know how many miles I need to run before my race in a month and a half or so. If I ran all those miles tomorrow, is that going to help me for the race when it comes time for the race day? It'll probably give me a stress fracture and I'll be out for race day. If I wait till the day before the race to run all those miles, is that going to help me? No, it's going to devastate me. But if I distribute those miles over the time I have and put in the work every single day, then I build myself up, build up my body physically to be able to handle the maximum amount of stress on race day and maximize the impact that I can have. Will I achieve my goal? Maybe, maybe not. But I know that whatever happens, it'll be based off of me putting forth my best effort. And so for those folks who are thinking about getting involved, the answers are out there. Get involved locally, find a candidate, run for office, contribute to an organization, volunteer at a nonprofit. There's no shortage of things to do. Reach out to Dr. Beri and ask what you can do. She'll give you advice, I promise you. My only advice that I will give you is think about what can be sustainable. What can you be doing as small or as seemingly insignificant as it is? What do you know you can do every day for the next 365 days? What do you know you can do for the next 5 years? And then build off of that. Once that gets easy, then build. There was a time where running 3 miles a day seemed to me impossible. And now, if I only do that, I know I'm doing myself a disservice because my body can physically handle more. Your mental capacity works the same way. Figure out what's sustainable for you. And then once that becomes so easy that it's like breathing, then build off of that.
I was laughing because I tend to think of, these problems and challenges that we have in our world and human man-made problems that we create.
Yeah.
They have existed from the day humans existed. And honestly, they're going to exist until human species just are extinct. So this idea that, to your point, that we can maximize and, it's almost like they want to use the Lean Six Sigma concept in activism and in changing policy. But this is a journey and we're on this journey and we're going to maybe take a couple steps back. We're going to move forward. It's a rhythm and it's a dance of what we're doing here, but we can never get off of it. I remember last year, I asked you this question over dinner and I said that I was feeling really guilty about, that I'm not doing enough, or I was feeling guilty that I was getting burnt out and I was feeling bad about this. And I remember you said something like, this is a revolving, door. There are people who are going to come in and who are going to do the work and they're going to go and they're going to rest. And that's okay because they have contributed and done their part. They may come back in, they may never come back in, but there's always going to be others that are going to come. And that has really stayed with me because it's that idea that it's okay to rest. It's okay that you want to take care of your home life. You want to take care of your personal life. And also, you are one person in this really big challenge that we're in, but you're not the only person who is working on these challenges that we have. If we see ourselves as there's one vision, that there's a North Star. Our North Star is how do we keep our human species alive? And how do we keep us thriving in a society where we're really, truly, considering evolution. I think about this as a place of like, how do humans evolve? And it's not about technological advances or things like that, but it's how does human evolve? And I think emotional intelligence, empathy, compassion, these are parts of that evolution that are going to make our society really successful. So, when you see that, and to your point of just do that one thing, I think of it also as if you're scared of getting involved in office or going to a nonprofit and getting out there, start with just reading books. Start with, following Qasim on, social media and really consuming what you're saying. Start paying attention, not to news on a minute by minute basis, but start to pay attention to, all right, let me go back and actually do some research on what was the whole Rosa Parks movement happen? Like, what was the booth, where they sat and that happened? Like, things like that. And that can really make a difference too. So I'm curious for you what does that look like for the person who is not yet ready to get involved in the way that you're suggesting to, but someone who's just kind of broaching the idea of activism?
Yeah, and I think I feel guilty because I can't remember the woman who gave this analogy. I can't remember her name because I saw it on social media. But she gave the analogy of a church choir that you have 100 people up there holding this beautiful note for 5 minutes straight. It's not because all 100 people can hold the note for 5 minutes straight. It's because they hold for 60 seconds at a time, and then they'll pause and breathe, and the other group will start. So it seems like one long note for 5 minutes straight. And that's exactly how activism works. Your point about reading is so astute. James Baldwin beautifully talks about this, where he says that you think you've suffered the most pain of anyone in the world, and then you read. And it just, you begin to understand that, okay, I'm actually not alone. Others have gone through this and others have overcome this. Mark Twain says those who do not read have no advantage over those who cannot read. And so, yes, read, and read some more. And what you read matters as well. Read the books by the scholars. We live in this anti-intellectualism movement right now. And if you study
For a reason.
Hungary, yeah,
Very intentionally done.
very interesting done. And if you study, the rise of autocratic dictatorships throughout history, even through the 20th and 21st century, they are all preceded by an attacking of the journalistic institutions, an attacking of academia, of attacking of scientists, of this anti-intellectualism movement. And I don't know what it is. I'm not a psychologist. I don't know what it is about the human species that is drawn to that. But unfortunately, it's a proven model that has worked with fascists time and time again to the detriment of the many involved. So read the books by the scholars. Read the books by the folks who have done the work on the ground. Follow the newsletters and the blogs and the platforms of those who are actually doing the work and can back it up with facts. And I think if you do an effective job of reading and of associating with the people doing the work and following their work, that inevitably you're going to be fired up and inspired to take action. And what that action is really depends on where your passion is. For some, it's women's rights. For some, it's combating the AIDS epidemic. For some, it's trying to cure cancer. For some, it's saving animals, right? There's no wrong thing because these are all necessary components of a healthy society. And so what I tell folks is worry less about where your passion takes you. Worry more about being sustainable and making yourself the expert. Because I can tell you this, you're not going to boil the ocean. You're not going to solve every problem out there. But if you truly invest your time as the lead expert on one, maybe two issues, then not only will you start to become a leader in your community and more people will support you in that space, but you'll also begin to recognize the experts in other communities where then you can support them as well. There are things that I am an expert in. I know international human rights law. I know the US Constitution. I can talk about these things till I'm blue in the face. I am not an expert on, neuroscience and behavioral psychology. So I will lean on the experts to understand from them how to approach these problems. And that's how it should work. Start small, be consistent, become an expert on that one or two thing, go 2 feet wide and 20 miles deep, and you'll start to build amazing community and begin to realize that your work through that synergy is going to be enhanced far more than you thought possible on your own.
I want to take it back to also something that I think is really important is activism, just even like what happened with you as a kid, that you were just surrounded by so many role models of individuals who were doing those things. So the things that you can be doing at home. And, I want to share a story about this experience I had. It was about a year ago. I was speaking at a conference and I was talking about, the narrative of a woman and empathy. And after I give the talk and everything, there's this woman who walked up to me, and she was a woman who was, born and raised in India, moved here in her 20s or something, married, has kids. And she comes up to me and she says to me that, something that just she feels so helpless about is the rape culture and just how the rape epidemic is in Delhi, specifically in India, and how unsafe it is for women to walk around there. And she's like, I donate money and, I give it to nonprofits and all this stuff, but I feel like my hands are tied and I should be doing more. And I asked her, I was like, do you have kids? And she said, yes, I have, a son and I have a daughter. I was like, well, that's where it starts. If you can raise your son to respect his sister, if you can speak to them in the same manner, if you're praising your son for his intellect, you're doing the same to your daughter. If you're asking her to help around the house, you're asking him to do the same. If the way you are speaking about women, the media, the TV shows you're watching, the jokes that are being made, are they being made at the expense of you? Are they being made all those jokes about, my wife made me, right? And so it's like, but the thing is that those things then hold power. They hold a conversation that happens, and now your son is learning like, oh, it's okay for me to make a joke at a woman's expense. It's okay for me to say these things. And if you then combat that, or if you challenge that, it gets looked on as, you're being difficult because you're actually holding us accountable in this way. But if you start it with what you're doing then is the most powerful form of activism, where it is you're raising the next generation of boys to respect women. And you're raising that. And I see that in the stories, Qasim, that you share about, you just shared a story on social media about how your son came home from school and some boys were teasing him to say, oh, well, we'll play with you if you go kiss this girl. And he said no. And it was about consent, and how his teachers praised him and told you that, we're so proud of him for not falling into peer pressure around this. And so when I think about, activism and empathy and compassion, I also think about it as, what are you doing in the actions at home? And clearly you saw that growing up as a kid, and now you're doing that actively in your home with your son as well. So what is that relationship that, parents and young parents who are raising young boys today can really consider and think about in activism that starts at home?
Well, it's that, I can't stand the saying that boys will be boys. I think it's such a defeatist and cowardly statement. I replace that with boys will be the boys we teach them to be. And it's just a fact, right? Whenever you say boys will be boys, it means you've taught them to be misogynistic, patriarchal pricks, and you're trying to excuse yourself, actually, by saying, well, that's just how they are. No, that's how they were taught. Again, to quote James Baldwin, he beautifully says that, I have often seen children disobey their elders. I have never seen them fail to imitate them. And that ultimately is what it comes down to, is what example are you setting from a behavioral standpoint? Example I had set for me was a level of sacredness, where if I raised my voice to my mother, I got whooped. I don't think this generation spanks their kids anymore, but my generation, I got spanked. I got whooped for raising my voice to my mother, and realized, okay, well, now I'm like, well, maybe physical violence wasn't the best way, but it worked for me. And so it set a precedent for me that, no, I don't raise my voice to women for any reason whatsoever. And what's funny now is at home, we've got 2 boys and a girl. The girl's the youngest. She rules the house. When she's in trouble, it's because she hears me lower my voice. And I lower my voice just a little bit, and then the waterworks come on that, the Abu yelled at me. And it's actually me lowering my voice and speaking slower with a deeper voice, that's considered yelling at this point. And her siblings know that they're not allowed to yell at her either. And if they do raise their voice, then, and I find out about it, they know that they're in trouble as well. So it's these little subtle things that you just develop the habit early on, and it goes. But I think it goes further than that, right? That's kind of the first level. I think the second level is how we talk about this language, even in academia, right? Why is it called violence against women? Like, is violence like this magical thing happening in the sky that's falling upon women because they're outside without an umbrella? Like, what's happening here? When we talk about, 98% of rapists, according to RAINN, are able to avoid prison altogether. Well, why aren't we identifying who these rapists are? Like, it should be 98% of men who commit rape are exonerated or protected by this broken criminal injustice system, broken carceral system. And so, naming these issues is extraordinarily critical. And then finally, I'll point out that we often try to tribalize misogyny and say, well, it's those people over there, not recognizing that the United States is consistently among the top 10 most dangerous nations on earth for women. At a minimum, according to the most conservative estimates, 1 in 3 women will suffer sexual assault at some point in her lifetime. There is no other scenario, none, where 1 in 3 people are suffering harm due to something, and that something is allowed to perpetuate. If 1 in 3 cars were made by Toyota were causing deaths and fatalities, Toyota would be off the market overnight. If 1 in 3 boxes of cereal had razor blades in them that were killing children, that company would be out of business right away, and its executives would probably be in jail. If 1 in 3 athletes in a sport were dropping dead after playing the game, that sport would be banned. But for some reason, men can abuse at least 1 in 3 women, and we're like, boys will be boys. It just happens. It's nonsense. It's infuriating. It's angering. And I think this is a men's issue. I don't consider this a women's issue. I consider this a men's issue, and men need to be much more accountable in this space. And the thing is, and I'll close my rant with this. This is not a high bar. I get emails all the time from people saying that you're just an anti-male hating male. I've never raped anybody before. I'm like, do you want a goddamn cookie? Like, that is not a high bar. Like, do you want a sticker that you put not a rapist? Like, is that really what you aspire to be in life? Like, give me a break here. Like, you need to hold yourself to a higher standard than, at least I didn't rape somebody. It's just pathetic, and it's infuriating that we even have to have this conversation. So this is what I say to men out there. Like, if you want to be a man, if you want to be the so-called alpha male, then act like one. recognize the equity and equality of women and play an active role in stopping your fellow men from committing that violence. Because in this situation, being silent is being complicit, and the bar of not being a rapist is not something you should be proud of.
Yeah, Qasim, the reason I'm laughing is because that low bar, I hear women all the time being like, oh my gosh, he responded to my message. That's so kind of him. It's like this very low bar that we do have because we've been trained that we need to shrink ourselves. But again, all of this just goes back to that idea again of, extending that hand of empathy and compassion, of just recognizing that it's not about the fact that I didn't do it. And when you're sharing that, the fact that you're getting these hate mails about like, well, I'm not this, so, why are you attacking us as a whole? I think that for activism and for us, for every single person, right? Man, woman, non-binary, it doesn't matter. But for every single person to really lean in, we also have to learn to release our identity attachment to what this topic is about, right? Yeah. I recognize that as a woman, like I can have certain kinds of privileges that, someone else doesn't have of a different race, but that doesn't mean that, I have to feel bad about it. Like I can feel like, wow, I'm very lucky that I do get to have this, but now how do I use this opportunity to extend my hand to someone who doesn't have that opportunity? Yeah. And I think it's about recognizing that, that detachment from identity, I think is like that first step in being able to be a, healthy player in activism so that you're not taking your hostility and rage and using that to channel it into activism, but you're channeling it, like you mentioned earlier, taking your rage and anger about something and questioning yourself first about what's my position on this? Mm-hmm. What role do I play in this? What is the accountability that I need to hold on to this? And then channeling it for impact of good. And so with that, I want to close this out with just asking you, like, if there is one reframe that you would ask of, individuals who are being activists, but they're leading with anger and not with empathy and compassion, or for those individuals who are wanting to come into it, but there's, and they're coming into it from a place of rage or anger, but you really want to reframe this as how do you channel this into empathy? What would be the one reframe that you would ask for current activists, for individuals who are coming into activism, to take what they're experiencing and to channel it with empathy and compassion and extending that movement forward versus, making it more about their internal identity?
I'm reminded of two quotes from Malcolm X. First one where he was asked, do you think we've made progress? And he said, no, I will never say we've made progress. If you stick a knife 9 inches in my back and pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. Progress is healing the wound that the blow made. And they won't even admit the knife is there. And so the first thing I want to point out is you want to channel your rage into removing that knife. How do we actively remove that knife? Let that be your North Star. Whatever that knife is, whether it's the legacy of redlining, whether it's the legacy of women not having financial autonomy until 1974, whether it's the harm caused by bans on reproductive health access, whether it's these fascist ICE raids. How do we remove that knife that's causing injustice? If your rage can meaningfully be channeled towards that, then you're doing it right. But if it's just going to exacerbate that, then you're basically fighting for your ego, which is not what we need right now. That's one. Two, Malcolm X also said that don't be in such a hurry to judge somebody because they don't know what you know or act like you act or speak how you speak. There was a time when you didn't know what you know now. And I reflect on this because it is so easy for me to say, well, Dr. Beri, you should know that, I had this experience, and the fact that you don't means that you just don't care, so I'm going to shut you out. It's very easy for me to say. So it's a defense mechanism, right? It's a natural thing to say, I'm going to stay protected and insulated and kind of recluse into myself so that I can demonize you and say, well, it's her fault, not my fault. But the hard part is to say, okay, maybe she should have known, but she doesn't. And so what harm would it be for me to say, Dr. Beri, I know you meant well, but this is the truth that I need you to be aware of. Now, if you're the empathetic person that I hope you are, you'll do better next time. And then if next time you come and say, you know what, I actually don't care about that experience, you can go F yourself. Now I don't have to guess or worry anymore. And that's hard because it requires you to be vulnerable. It requires you to put yourself in a situation of vulnerability. And I don't want anyone to feel like they have to put themselves in any kind of danger. I will say, by and large, you will find that when you lead with that empathetic approach and let people recognize that you are a safe space for that, then overall you'll be shocked in a very positive way how many people go out of their way to protect your rights. And this is something that I want to emphasize, that the more time you spend being relentlessly focused on protecting the rights of others, you will be so beautifully amazed at how much more aggressively people spend trying to protect your rights, because they see you as a gem of humanity that needs to be protected. There's a famous quote by Imam Ali, the fourth caliph after Prophet Muhammad, where he said that the rights that others have over you, forget them. The rights that you owe others, honor them. And it's that mentality that requires empathy. It requires swallowing the ego. It requires swallowing your pride and recognizing the long-term game. And it absolutely, I'm not going to sugarcoat this, absolutely will result in you getting burned sometimes. There's no doubt about it. That's the world we live in. And what I want to emphasize is that getting burned is far less dangerous than us living in our own little cocoons and letting a fascist take over just because he's done a better job of organizing while keeping us divided. We don't have the luxury of being divided in this world and space. We don't have to agree on everything, but if we can agree on the basic human dignity of one another, then everything else, race, religion, gender, nationality, socioeconomic class, it all fails to break that apart. Maintain that aspect of human dignity, and I promise you, you will start to see major results, not just in the short term, but especially in the long term.
Thank you, Qasim, so much for coming on, for sharing this, and honestly, leaving it with that. I don't think there's anything more to say that, couldn't be more beautiful than what you just ended with. So I just want to just acknowledge all the work that you've been doing, the way that you have so intentionally created that safe space for so many to reach out to you, to show that, to experience that. And, I know that this is going to be such an important conversation for the listeners to hear. How can they connect with you? How can they reach out to you?
Very easy to find. Just my website is QasimRashid.com. That's my human rights newsletter. Let's Address This with Qasim Rashid. You can subscribe for free or for a cup of coffee a month. I will emphasize that I have no paywall. So don't feel like you have to be a paid subscriber to get access to content. Being a paid subscriber gets you 0 special privileges or access to content. Subscribe because it's in your budget and you want to support a human rights lawyer. But otherwise, my content is always accessible for all people, irrespective. I'm on social media on every platform at Qasim Rashid, and looking forward to connecting with you and engaging with you.
Thank you so much, Qasim.
Thank you.
I really hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I just have one favor to ask you. If you could just make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a rating and review, it's going to help us tremendously to make sure that we reach as many people as possible that you think should be listening to our episodes. I'll see you next week for another episode, and thank you so much for leaving that one review, that one subscription, and sharing this with your friends.